Squash Dog Radio.
All right, we are live, Squash Dog Radio, with Darius in California. What part of California are you in, sir? If you don't mind saying, you can say a general area.
San Diego,
Nice.
yeah, Encinitas specifically.
Nice. Is that where you're from?
I'm from Buffalo, New York.
Oh, nice. That's quite the change. From palm trees where you're at now to 20,000 feet of snow in the wintertime.
Exactly.
That can be brutal. So, when did you move to Cali?
I've just been here for about 4 months now, and I'm going to be going back to New York next week.
Nice. What are you doing out in Cali?
I'm just visiting some friends.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. I've been teaching Latin in Buffalo for the past 6 years.
Really? And
At a
you,
charter, yeah, at a charter school.
oh, nice. And you want to tell us a little bit about your background and brief biography? You don't have to be brief. You can be brief, whatever you want.
Sure. I started studying philosophy at Northfield Mount Herman Preparatory School in Northfield, Massachusetts. And I knew when I went to college I was going to be a philosophy major. So I started studying philosophy at the University of Vermont. And I transferred to the University of Buffalo to learn under Dr. Cho, who was the student of Gadamer, who was the disciple of Heidegger. So I started studying phenomenology and Heideggerian studies with him. And after I got my BA, I joined the classics department at UB and started reading Greek and Latin texts, mostly to be aware of the language and because I also have an interest in ancient philosophy. If you really want to understand philosophy, my personal opinion is you need to know the history of philosophy to be able to, it's a dialogue that's been going on for a couple thousand years now. So if you want to join that dialogue, you have to know the history of philosophy too. So I started reading the old texts, and I did my thesis on Cicero and his work called the Tusculan Disputations. And so after I graduated, I started teaching Latin, and that's where I've been for the past 6 years.
Nice.
Yeah.
And so you're pretty fluent in Latin, or you are fluent in Latin?
Yeah, so Latin is now written. The Romance languages, Spanish, French, Romanian, Portuguese, and Italian, evolved from Latin.
Mm-hmm.
And also ancient Greek. So Epic Greek, Homeric Greek, and also Classical Greek, which is what Plato was writing in and Aristotle.
I've always enjoyed Latin. I was somewhat active in the Roman Catholic Church when I was younger, so there was a lot of Latin going on there. And more recently, I did my undergraduate in biology, so all the taxonomic nomenclature is in Latin. The genus and species names of organisms and things. So right. I've always enjoyed that. So you can read the actual philosophical text of, say, Aristotle in Latin, and you don't have to really rely on the translations as much.
Yeah, so Aristotle's writing in Greek, and
Greek, rather, yeah.
Yeah, philosophy really starts in Greece with the pre-Socratics, and they're writing in Greek, and it wasn't really until Cicero in the 1st century BC, he was the first to put philosophy into the Latin language. So So he's the first one that the Romans were pretty skeptical of philosophy when they first encountered it. and it took him a little while to to catch on to it. So if you want to start with the origins of philosophy, you would look towards the Greeks.
That makes sense.
But yes, I can read Aristotle in Greek. I've read the Poetics in Greek, which is his interpretation of where tragedy comes from. And I've read the Plato's dialogue, Plato's Symposium, or excuse me, yes, Plato's Symposium in Greek, and some of the pre-Socratic fragments too. But I also read the lyric the poetry that's written in Greek too. So yeah, I have firsthand experience translating the text.
Do you feel like a lot is lost in translation?
I would say yes. I would say so. Even if you're looking at more modern day texts like Being in Time by Heidegger, Dr. Cho would tell me that over 50% is lost in translation. The language, contrary to what you might think, becomes over time less complex and more simple. So the older languages like Greek are much more technical and complex than modern day languages, like even modern day Greek. If you take a look at English, for instance, there are moods that have been lost, there are tenses that have been lost. So, I mean, English has lost gender completely, whereas if you look at German, English is a Germanic language, but it borrows Latin words. English doesn't have gender anymore. So masculine, feminine, neuter are completely lost in the English language. So I would say yes, there is a lot lost in translation. And it's just nobody can write like the last person to have really mastered the English language was Shakespeare. Nobody has written since like him since. So language has become so simple. It doesn't even compare to Greek and Latin.
And language seems to evolve and degrade perhaps over time. It just kind of depends on your preconceived idea of how it should be. Some people are more formal with language than others. Some people say this is how it has been and this is how it should continue to be. And then I feel like others recognize the more metamorphosis of language is like a naturally occurring process, like it's going to change over time. Like when you factor in different colloquialisms from different areas, slang terms and stuff, it's amazing to me to see the way the language is developed and changed. It doesn't necessarily make it wrong. But
no, of course, language is always changing.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, from a grammatical standpoint,
sure.
For instance, the middle voice, English doesn't even have the middle voice, which we've lost certain grammatical functions of language, which you find in Greek or even Latin. Latin has the subjunctive, which English doesn't have anymore. We say should or would, whereas in Latin, they're different case endings that you would attach to the end of verbs to show that complexity.
And do you think
for Heidegger, that was the middle voice was particularly important because it was his methodology was allowing nature to reveal itself, and the middle voice was a tool that could be used in his philosophy to allow things to reveal themselves instead of instead of projecting our own kind of a priori conditions on something. He would allow things to reveal themselves, and for him, the middle voice was important to do that.
And you feel as if we've kind of lost that over time?
Yeah, if you look at uh, science today, we have the tendency to measure things, to weigh things, to numberize things. And for Heidegger, uh, he tried to take a step back and have things reveal themselves instead of projecting uh, categories onto certain things.
Let's get into Heidegger a little bit. So, you're the professor you worked under, was it at the University of Vermont?
Was at the University of Buffalo.
Buffalo, okay. So he was your master's advisor, right? And you worked with him?
Uh, I
Dr.
worked,
Cho?
yeah, I did undergraduate work with him.
Okay. And what was his background? You said he was like a Heidegger specialist, kind of, or?
He was Korean.
Mm-hmm.
He studied in Germany under Gadamer, who was the disciple of Heidegger.
Aha. So there's a direct connection there.
Sure. Husserl is considered the father of phenomenology. And
What's that?
phenomenology is a methodology. Husserl was a mathematician.
Gotcha.
And phenomenology is the study of being, or I guess it's a methodology that he would use to study the world.
Like a way to measure
Phenomena, to study phenomena.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Heidegger kind of used phenomenology as a starting point, but kind of developed it into his own philosophy.
And had you had much experience with Heidegger prior to your undergraduate time, or did this professor kind of really turn you on to his work?
Well, when I was at most philosophy done nowadays in universities is analytic philosophy. So it's hard to find somebody who has such firsthand experience with continental philosophy. Philosophy has been kind of divided into two camps, and mostly what you see in American universities is analytic philosophy, philosophy of language, philosophy of science, and you might have somebody doing ancient philosophy or someone doing English philosophy or even American philosophy. English philosophers being Locke and Hume. American philosophers like John Dewey, pragmatism. But in Europe, they're more they would call it continental. History of philosophy. They're looking at Hegel, Kant. So the type of philosophy that I've been doing, at least at UB, what I saw is that it was pushed into the comparative literature departments. I remember when Dr. Cho, he's in his 90s now, and when he was on his way out, he said they're not going to find somebody to replace me, and they haven't. So there's not really anybody, at least at UB, University of Buffalo, who's doing anything like Heideggerian studies or even phenomenology that's been pushed into the comparative literature department.
And you feel as if universities are kind of out of a loss because of that. That's important stuff. It should be discussed.
I don't think you can devoid philosophy from the history of philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
It's just something I think needs to be taken into account. I was not in touch. It seems departments seem to be very disconnected. Even when I joined the classics department at UB, there was prejudice. And when I tried to go back into the philosophy classrooms, I wasn't really in touch with what they were doing.
It's all disjointed. And they have these standards that they need to adhere to.
Sure.
And Did you ever feel as if certain academic departments were more focused on promoting some kind of social or political ideology and using the texts that they studied to promote that in a way? I know that universities tend to be very liberal orientated, very left leaning, and I'm just curious as to whether I've been kind of disconnected for a while. My undergraduate ended back in 2015, and all of my research towards the end was all science, so it was all, you can't really work in your own personal belief structure there
Mm.
as you could with more of a arts and sciences or kind of arts or philosophical standpoint. Science is very rigid. It's hard to work in your own opinion. And do you feel like a lot of people, a lot of professors and stuff are biased in a sense?
They're definitely protecting their own.
Sure.
If you have people that have graduated from Yale, they're going to take. I mean, if the teachers, the professors there are going to, they're going to. I mean, they're taking people from their own schools. That's why Dr. Cho was never replaced. He was pushed out,
You really?
or he wasn't pushed out, but when he left, didn't replace him, and that was for ideological reasons.
It's political. There's a lot of bullshit that goes on in universities.
Sure.
But it must be tolerable for you because you stayed in the academic world. I don't know if that's because of.
Yeah, I would like to go back and get a Ph.D. When I applied for my PhDs, I applied to. I saw that to get a degree in classics and to teach at a university, you really need to go to a good school, or else you're just going to end up doing what I'm doing right now, which is teaching in high school and middle school. So when I was applying for my PhDs, I applied to the top. For classics, I applied to the top 5 schools in the country, and I came up short. So I'm going to try for a PhD in philosophy. I think that's a little bit more. There are more universities teaching philosophy than classics.
Mm-hmm.
Most universities have a philosophy department. Not all have a classics department.
And there is some interconnectivity between the two, you feel? The classics. I mean, there's a lot of philosophy contained within the classics.
For me, yes. Like for Nietzsche, for instance, I don't think you can understand Nietzsche, his original work, The Birth of Tragedy, unless you have a background in classics. Mm-hmm. He's talking about tragedy, and so the big difference I see is that in the classics department, you're reading the original text, and there's not as much in a classroom. There's not as much critical analysis in the classroom as you would see in a philosophy class, where you're not reading the text in, let's say, Greek or Latin, and it's mostly critical analysis.
So with the classics, there's more of an opportunity to be creative with your interpretation, in a sense?
It's more the study of the history of ideas than philosophical analysis. I mean, ancient philosophy, what I have concentrated on mostly, is such a niche. It's just a small amount of people doing it.
Which is a good to an extent.
I'd say it makes it more competitive.
But it can be lonely. There's limited people to talk to about it,
Right. I have a hard time. You really have to have somebody who knows what they're talking about for me to have a conversation with.
Yeah, no, I mean, because you're on another level. You know what I mean? Like, you understand it so thoroughly because you've really dedicated your time and your life to it, as opposed to someone such as myself who just, go sit in the garage and read some philosophy every once in a while.
As I mentioned, it's a 2,000-year-old discipline.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's certain words have so much baggage. I mean, look, that's why Heidegger had to invent his own language, is because philosophy for a few thousand years before him had so much history to it, and he decided to come up with his own kind of language to navigate, be creative, to come up with kind of new ideas or new interpretations. You look at a word like logos that's been used for a couple thousand years, it's got so much connected to it that just to throw that word around, you know, it's almost lost its meaning. It's almost devoid of meaning.
Let's not throw it around. So, well, first of all, logos or logos?
The accent is over the first omicron, so it would be logos.
Logos. So I've been saying it wrong for all these years. So thank you for that. That's important to me because I don't want to sound too stupid here. Yeah. But what? Okay. So what does it mean to you, more or less? Let's hear your interpretation. in 10 words or less. Just kidding. I mean, the significance of the term, you know, it's been a while for me. I mean, I haven't read into this stuff in a long time. I believe it was something along the lines of the word or...
in the first line of the Gospel of John is en arche ein ha logos. So in the beginning was the word. Mm-hmm. But that's we already see that word crops up in Christianity. So in Christianity, you might get a different interpretation than if you're looking at the pre-Socratics who use the word. But I would say it's the logical structure of the world, the patterns, the paradigms, or even the way that things operate on a mechanical level.
The underlying principles.
Sure.
In a way that connect particular schools of thought, for instance. Maybe. I'm generalizing.
Sure. I mean, look at it today. I mean, what is something that's logical? Something that follows certain patterns. That's not chaotic or improvisational. Mm-hmm. I don't know.
Well, that's why I'm excited to get this math guy in here and to see what kind of crossover there is between your academic background and his. Because I'm always interested to hear how mathematics and philosophy are interrelated.
Yeah.
Because they are connected. And one of the most interesting realizations for me was when I studied formal logic. And I started looking at argumentation and symbolically representing arguments and things like that. I mean, it was mind-blowing for me. People such as yourself, that you guys are on a different level, you know? Like, this stuff is just fascinating to me for the most part because it confuses the fuck out of me, you know? But I like to talk to people such as yourself who understand it more. Do you have... Did you have any experience, undergrad or graduate, in formal logic?
I had to take a logic class.
You did?
That was a requirement.
What was your thoughts on that? I mean, did you enjoy it? Was it bullshit? I mean, was it just boring?
I think Aristotelian logic, for instance, all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. I kind of like that. Mm-hmm. But when it got into... I think it's called symbolic logic.
Yeah.
That kind of, I didn't retain it.
Like Bertrand Russell stuff.
Yeah,
you know,
that's
the Principia Mathematica, where he just has this 900-page text, 3 volumes, and 80% of it is just these symbolized arguments. Like,
for me, I found it. What I've seen is that logic is no longer a tool of philosophy. It has become philosophy. I mean, originally philosophy was physics, ethics, and logic.
Uh-huh.
I should say, by the time Plato opens his academy, it's been compartmentalized. So logic was just a component or a tool used in philosophy. It wasn't philosophy itself. And that's what I see is happening in analytical schools, is that philosophy has become, logic has become the philosophy to do.
Interesting. And so, would you say that the hard sciences were more closely connected to philosophy in the past, and as we've formalized more academic systems for scientific discovery and inquiry, they've kind of become segregated in a sense?
Yeah, if you look at physics, the first philosophers were called physiologoi, so those who spoke on nature, and physis, which is the root of the word physics, means nature. So the original philosophers were discussing nature. There was no compartmentalization of philosophy or science. It all was philosophy at its origin. And by the time Plato comes around, it's become categorized. And what Heidegger wants to do, if you look at, I keep bringing up Heidegger, but he wants to kind of bring back philosophy to its roots and study philosophy without compartmentalizing it.
That makes sense. Well, my question becomes how much of philosophy, because science is rooted in objectivity,
Mm-hmm.
testability, falsifiability, deductive reasoning, right? And philosophy can be subjective, it can be opinionated. There can be evidence that's presented in support of a particular claim. But I feel like that's why the divergence occurred, is that science became more formalized in the sense that, the development of the scientific method, here's a hypothesis, we test it, we attempt to disprove it. By not doing so, we strengthen the hypothesis and we develop workable theories. And philosophy, I don't know, this may be a misconception on my behalf, but a lot of it is opinionated, but at the same time, it's very much rooted in evidence. But the evidence itself is not data driven or numerical, in as much as it's other philosophers. You know what I mean? They're taking previously existing philosophical concepts and interpret them in such a way and applying them to new principles. And, the breakdown becomes when math isn't involved or data. I'm not sure,
Yeah,
You know where I'm going?
Yes, I understand it, and I think you're at least kind of have the same belief that I do. And if you look at, let's say, physics, okay, up until Galileo, Aristotelian physics was the standard. So in Aristotle, you have the four elements. Air and fire are more heavenly; they go upwards. You can see that fire rises in the air, whereas water and earth move downwards, and they're the more base elements. And these are all empirically observable facts. Even the pre-Socratics, those before Socrates, were looking into the heavens and looking at the constellations. And it was really Socrates who brought philosophy down to the earth and made it a human subject matter. And up until Galileo, it was all based on empirical facts or empirical observable situations. But it took Newton to look at physics differently and to imagine something moving in outer space indefinitely. And that's something that you can't observe immediately. Or even Einstein's physics, where light has is the standard for the fastest, the standard for the fastest thing in the universe. So even that's more non-observable. That's something that can't be observed, or even I don't know if it can even be tested. For instance, if you move faster than the speed of light, that you would travel back in time. The theory of relativity. So, you know, it seems to me that it's become more hypothetical and less observable over time. I don't know if you could comment on that, maybe.
Well, things
Yes.
have become progressively more complex, in a way. If you think about science as it stood 2,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago, as opposed to science as it is today, things have become progressively more diverse and complex. There's so many different schools of thought with respect to scientific inquiry in each of the departments, you know. And that kind of gets back to what we were talking about previously with the connection between philosophy and mathematics and the way in which they've become somewhat separated. So the hierarchy of formal systems of science would be mathematics at the top, which is entirely abstract unless it's applied in some conceptual manner. If you apply mathematics outright, you come up with physics, because physics is just a matter of applied mathematics. You take physics, you apply that, you have chemistry, chemistry applied, biology, so on and so forth. But each one of those particular disciplines is so split. I mean, think about how many different schools of thought there are for physics, you know, there's and how many intertwining schools of thought there are. Biophysics, you know, physical chemistry, you know, bioastronomy, you know, astrobiology rather, and all of that stuff. Things have become more and more complicated in a sense. As we attempt to generate simplistic understandings of how things operate. What we want to do is we want to come up with the easiest, most simplistic manner with which we can describe a natural process. But in doing so, it kind of seems to logarithmically increase in complexity, if that makes sense.
Yes.
And as a result, there is less entanglement or interconnectivity in the sciences, despite the fact that it's all rooted on the same principles. But things, as we've discovered more, we've failed, not necessarily failed, but there's not one unifying theory. Like they had talked about Einstein and whatnot, finding that unified theory of physics. That would be ideal. Just one generalized explanation of everything. And things have become progressively more complex over time. And it's a matter of, will we kind of go so far and then start coming back? Start simplifying again? Start getting back to the core of our initial belief structure?
That's a good question. And, you know, is there a grand unifying theory of everything? I'm kind of skeptical. But does that mean that we've lost track of certain questions? We no longer raise the question anymore. For instance, the meaning of being, what it means to be. Are there certain questions we're not raising because we've become so narrow?
Is there something that we're missing, you know? Well, on that note, Eric has arrived.
Yep.
Thanks for joining us, Eric.
Yeah, no problem.
I'm sitting here with Darius. He is a contemporary philosopher, philosophy scholar. And would you like to give me a little insight, or us rather, a little insight into your background, please?
Right, so I'm currently starting my fourth year of undergraduate study in math. I mostly study number theoretic things. So I just put up a paper, or I'm about to put up a paper on the archive concerning partitions and modular forms. I've also done some work in moonshine and elliptic curve areas. So
Nice. And you're not in classes right now? You're done for for
classes
the
have
summer?
actually just started for me
Nice. All
yesterday.
online?
Yeah, so I'm back at home, and classes have started online. Yeah.
Okay. Where are you from, if you don't mind me asking?
I live in the Seattle area,
Nice.
but I go to school at Georgia Tech. So
Oh, cool. Okay. So we were just talking about a lot of things, but something that we kind of touched upon was the development of philosophy over time and how science and philosophy were once very closely connected, and there seemed to be a divergence between the two. I'm not sure if I'm paraphrasing correctly, Darius. You know, does it seem to be right? Kind of where we were headed?
Well, I would say that the studies have become narrow. They've branched off, and there's a lot of disconnect, I would say, between different departments.
Well, how about the theoretical mathematics that Eric does? That's philosophical in a sense, right? Would you say? Can you hear me all right, by the way, Eric? Is everything coming through
yeah,
clear?
yeah, I can
Okay,
hear
good.
you.
So I've always been fascinated by theoretical mathematics because to me it's like mathematics to me always needs to have some kind of practical application, and I'm trying to training myself to not view it in such a way. I'm always kind of prone to view math as applied within the context of physics, chemistry, biology, etc. But
Right, and I think a lot of pure mathematicians do math just because they appreciate the beauty of it. That's definitely a large reason of why I do math. I think number theory in particular is kind of especially beautiful. There, in my view, there seem to be a lot of, I guess, mysteries in math. A lot of coincidences that happen that seem like coincidences to us, but in reality might not actually be coincidences. They might be part of a larger theory that we just haven't really discovered yet. And so, kind of, a lot of mathematicians is kind of a lot of mathematics is kind of searching for that larger theory. Uh,
unifying theory.
right, and I think it there are a lot of philosophical kind of applications to this pure math. There's a lot of debate between whether pure math is created by humans or kind of if it's discovered. I mean, Darius probably knows more about this than I do, but I think there are a lot of kind of philosophical connections between doing pure math and the study of philosophy.
Darius, would you like to comment on that?
Sure. It seems like uh, if you look at math, I mean, what is the root of math? Math is uh, from Greek manthano, which means just to learn, to be able to learn. So whether that's rooted in the mind, uh, or it's something that we invent, or it's out there in nature, that's an interesting question. Where do numbers come from? Do they originate in our own mind, or are they actually existing out in the world? Um, I think Heidegger would say that numbers are learned in the disembodied state. There's no way to prove that or disprove it.
Right.
So my question becomes, if in fact mathematics is something that we've created and that we haven't necessarily just discovered, you know, the more developed we become in our mathematical understanding, the more difficult and it seems it would be to disregard that later down the line. You know, we're so attached to it now. We're so affixed to using this methodology to describe natural phenomena. Perhaps when we first started to develop our mathematical postulates, if another alternative interpretation came up, we could have abandoned this. But now it's so ingrained within our being that I think it would be hard to get away from it, you know?
When you start numerically defining objects and things around you, you lose sight of the essence of what that thing is. So, for instance, you can weigh an apple, you can measure an apple, but what if that apple, for instance, has is food for an animal? Then are you losing what the essence of an apple is by just weighing it and observing it and writing down facts about that apple? Or it could be, the home of like a worm inside of it. So, does the apple lose its essence when you do measure it and weigh it? I would say yes. And that could be the danger of always observing the world around us in terms of numeric value.
To lose its essence would be, in a sense, to admit that that description is the absolute truth, though, would it not? It wouldn't necessarily lose its essence of what it is unless others said, well, this is how it was described, for instance, mathematically, therefore that's what it is. When someone such as you and I could say, well, this is how it's been described, but fuck that, this is what I think it is, and here's my evidence to support that.
Yeah, well, I would say that there are different ways to look at an apple besides just observing it and classifying it. That math is just one way of viewing the world, whereas there could be other ways of viewing the world. And if you do want to compartmentalize the meaning of something, then you're losing different aspects and perspectives of what the meaning of something could be.
Well, Eric, you talked about coincidences, correct?
Right.
Now, do you come from the school of, fuck this, there are no coincidences, I want to disprove that they are coincidences and demonstrate why things are the way that they are? Or would you advocate for an interpretation that says this is a coincidence, you know?
Right. I mean, I think a lot of mathematicians are on the side that these aren't coincidences. I mean, there are definitely things that are coincidences in math. I mean, when you work with so many numbers, you're bound to come across some coincidences eventually. But there are things that aren't coincidences. For example, a really famous example is the fact that e to the power of pi times the square root of 163. So it turns out if you plug this number, I mean, it's a huge number, but if you plug it into a calculator, it turns out that depending on what calculator you get, you might actually get an integer, which is not possible because e to the pi times square root of 163 has to be an irrational number. But it turns out that it's extremely, extremely close to an integer. So it turns out that I think after the decimal point, the first 10 or 12 digits are all nines. And you could look at something like that and say it's a coincidence. It's a coincidence that this number happens to be so close to an integer. But it turns out that it's really not a coincidence. So it turns out that kind of this fact follows from certain functions we know about and certain and their Fourier expansions essentially. It turns out that it actually follows from something that we understand very well. And so people at first thought this was just simply a coincidence that, if I take e to the pi times the square root of some number and I look at all numbers, I'm probably going to find one close to an integer eventually. But it turns out that it wasn't a coincidence, and it turns out it kind of followed from some ideas that we hadn't really figured out yet. And a lot of ideas in mathematics feel that way. There's so much structure, there's so much underlying structure and connections between different seemingly disparate areas of math that seem to us like coincidences now, but things in general seem so orderly and neat that it's hard to believe some of these things are coincidence. At least that's the way I view it. And I'm sure there are people who disagree with me.
Darius, thoughts on that?
I can't talk specifically about the example that you gave. I'm not sure. I would say that it can't be a coincidence why certain things follow from certain principles, because you're sort of you're going out to find reasons for why things are the way they are. So if you're going to come across something that might seem like a coincidence, you've already set yourself up to find a reason for what you're looking for. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea.
What you're setting out is to prove a hypothesis or gather evidence about a hypothesis. So you've already come up with an idea that there is a connection.
I think there are examples where it happens that people come across it randomly. So there are a couple examples. So for example, there's this famous function in mathematics called the J invariant, dealing with elliptic curves and modular forms and stuff like that. And it turns out this function has what we call a Fourier expansion. So for those of you that know Taylor series, Fourier expansions are kind of like Taylor series. And so we kind of care about the coefficients of the Fourier expansion. And it turns out, so for this J function, it turns out that the first coefficient is 1, but it turns out the next coefficient is the number 198,663, I believe it is. Not quite. Sorry.
He's checking his work. That's good.
Okay, yeah. So the number is 196,883. That's in the J invariant. And it turns out there is a completely separate part of mathematics concerning these mathematical objects called groups. And one of the things you can do is kind of look at the size of the groups, how big these things are. And it turns out there's kind of this very important example in mathematics called the monster group. And it turns out that the size of one of its what are called representations is 196,884. And so these two numbers are things that come from extremely separate parts of math. But it turns out that I believe it was John McKay who kind of had studied both of these areas of math and then said that these two numbers are only one off. And so again, this is something that seems like a coincidence, that these two numbers just happen to be one off from one another. And this wasn't something he was kind of setting out to find. It was just that he originally was a group theorist, studied the monster group, and then eventually later became a number theorist. And studied the J invariant. And so came across kind of these two things in his knowledge. And And of course, Monstrous Moonshine, it eventually kind of turned out that this was not a coincidence. It was a deeper theory hidden behind a relationship between these two things that we're still working to understand today. But I think that's kind of an example of something that no one was really setting out to try to figure out something like that. It just happened that he saw that the two numbers were just one off, and didn't really immediately write it off as just a coincidence, and people started to look into it. So, for example, John Conway, the famous mathematician, did a lot of work in this area.
And what kind of long-term implications do you think that has? Or rather, do you feel as if it's common to discover something throughout the course of your research that was unexpected? Sometimes you do all this work and nothing becomes of it. Other times you develop the proof that you were looking for, and occasionally you come across something that you had never expected. Three separate.
Yeah, so I think, at least for beginning researchers, a lot of them kind of are given problems by their advisors that their advisors generally kind of know how to solve and know that there's a good solution for. And so it really only becomes later that you kind of delve into the completely unknown. And even then, you kind of have an idea of what you're doing. A lot of mathematics is kind of generalizing ideas. So kind of, if we have this idea, but we have this restriction on it, can we kind of remove the restriction and make it more general? And a lot of mathematics is like that. In terms of implications, it turns out that Monstrous Moonshine actually has, or this coincidence I talked about, which is named Monstrous Moonshine.
Can you expand upon that a little bit? Monstrous Moonshine, what it is exactly?
Yeah, so Monstrous Moonshine is kind of this initial coincidence that these two numbers are only one apart. The two numbers.
Aha, that's right. Okay.
Yeah, and it turns out there's a much deeper theory. And it turns out it actually has physics applications in string theory.
Nice.
So things that I don't understand very well, but yeah.
Have you taken, or did you take any philosophy courses as an undergrad? You're in your undergrad now, yeah. Have you taken any?
I haven't taken any philosophy classes. I've read some philosophy, not much.
What have you read, or what did you like to read, or anything stand out to you?
Not really. I just read because I thought it was interesting. I haven't really delved much into it. I still think philosophy is super interesting, and of course we've talked a little bit about kind of the connection between doing pure mathematics and philosophy, which I try not to think about too much.
It's a mind fuck.
It is, yeah, and I think mathematicians in general don't think about it too much. They just kind of continue on their work since it doesn't really affect their work in any way.
Good thing or bad thing? Is that the kind of mathematician you want to be? Head down, focused, grinding out those equations, those numbers, in your room with, 1,000 servers trying to get the solution?
There's
There's no wrong answer here. I need to preface this. There's no wrong answer in my opinion.
Right. I mean, maybe I should address the fact that it's a pretty cliched view of mathematics.
Sure.
Mathematics is actually kind of surprisingly pretty social.
Nice.
There are definitely examples of people who lock themselves in their basement for years on end trying to solve a problem. And Andrew Wiles, who solved Fermat's last theorem, was a famous example of that.
I watched a documentary on him, actually.
Right. And so that's a famous example. But there are plenty of opposite. So, for example, Erdos was kind of famously prolific, kind of talked to everyone, worked with everyone, published with everyone. And that's kind of on the other end of the spectrum what mathematicians can be. And I think in general, mathematicians actually tend more towards this kind of social side, especially because pure mathematics is so specialized nowadays. A lot of the times, even within number theory, for example, people from different areas of number theory kind of ask each other for their expertise on certain things.
Sure.
And so it's very rare for a single person alone to be able to make big discoveries. It's usually kind of the work of many, many people with slightly different interests and knowledge that kind of come together to create something.
No, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I have to step away real quick. You gentlemen can either take a break or talk amongst yourself, or just talk amongst yourself. I'll be right back.
Yeah,
I
think
I was
have
gonna
to go to the bathroom real quick too.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know if there's anything you wanted to talk about, but
Well, I was going to say on that what we were just talking about in terms of, I know that most science is done nowadays in groups. You were saying mathematics too is
Right.
done as a group, but if you look at, for instance, Galileo or Einstein, they had a certain philosophical element that made them revolutionary. So maybe I'm wondering, maybe does science need to, or could science benefit from having a more philosophical approach to the work?
yeah. I think that's a genuinely interesting question. I think most mathematicians don't really care about these things because, for example, going back to what we were talking about earlier, regardless of if mathematics is created or discovered, it doesn't really affect the way they do mathematics. Either way, they're going to kind of continue proving theorems, creating conjectures, searching through data for patterns. And I think regardless of whether mathematics is created or discovered, kind of mathematicians are going to continue doing the same thing. And because of that, I think that's why most mathematicians don't care about the kind of philosophical implications in mathematics, because it wouldn't change what they do on a day-to-day basis.
Do you see without that the possibility of a disconnect between kind of a breakthrough like Einstein, or a grander theory for the nature of the world?
Yeah. I mean,
Is it possible that there could be another revolution in science if mathematicians are devoid or are not connected to the larger picture?
yeah. I mean, maybe the first thing I want to say is that most pure mathematicians, okay, maybe I shouldn't say most, but a lot of them don't really care about the physical applications.
Okay.
And I mean, that's partially for me too. We know that some people, of course, care a lot about these things. And so Conway, for example, talked a lot about the connection between monstrous moonshine and physics. But there are a lot of people who also do math kind of for the sake of math. Do math and develop math for the sake of kind of understanding the mysteries of math better.
Okay.
And not so much for creating a theory, or creating a framework for physics to use. Maybe I shouldn't say most, but a lot of mathematicians do math for the sake of math itself. And so that's partially why I don't think of kind of more philosophical ideas could really help mathematics in that way. It's mostly because math is kind of being done for the sake of math.
Right.
Like painting a picture.
What about on the what about when it comes to applied mathematics?
Yeah. in that case, I think it could potentially be helpful, but I think it would be more helpful on perhaps the physical side of things. A lot of the applied mathematicians I know kind of work on math that's just close to physics, that physicists use. They don't necessarily work on kind of physics itself. They just work on math that's really close to physics and that physicists use, for example, at least in my experience. And so it's...
Do you see people coming into the mathematics or the courses that you're taking from people outside of the field?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of the courses I take are kind of applicable to a lot of things, especially kind of courses in, for example, complex analysis or differential topology or differential geometry. These are all things that physicists use kind of every day. Differential topology is kind of the mathematical basis for general relativity, for example. And so it's definitely true that kind of, especially at an undergraduate level, a lot of the math that we study is used in physics. And so even beyond that, though, there are a lot of engineers that use this stuff too. For example, chemists use a lot of group theory. And I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of people just interested in it because they want to learn some math. But even beyond that, a lot of it is kind of applicable. For example, computer sciences and machine learning, there's a lot of topological implications there. And so it's true that, I mean, it's very true that math, of course, is used everywhere.
Could it be the case that some of these theoretical things that you're dealing with could be applied to the physical world?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like 1,000, 2,000 years ago, when people started thinking about and discovering prime numbers, people would have never thought they had the application that they do today. You know, nowadays, kind of it's used everywhere in cryptography and kind of cryptographic algorithms. But back then, the study of number theory was just kind of done for its own sake. And I think that's still true for the mathematics we do today. Kind of a lot of the mathematics we've done has been applied in some way. So even though mathematicians only really do math, or mathematicians mostly do math for the sake of doing math itself, a lot of other people have kind of used the ideas that we've developed.
Can you talk about some of the ideas that you're working on right now?
I can. Okay, what's maybe the easiest one to... So the paper I'm uploading to the archive soon is...
And before we go today, make sure you give me the title of that and link me to it so I can post it in the description of the podcast. I want to promote you on my website and everywhere else. So
there's no big deal. I mean, I'm
all about it, man.
I haven't uploaded it yet. Yeah, this was something I was supposed to do later.
Well, when you do, just make sure to hit me up so I can get it out there. I doubt,
yeah, it sounds good.
Whatever stoner comes on my website might want to read about it. So.
So the recent work I've been doing concerns partitions. So partitions are... So if I give you some numbers, so I say take the number 5, I can kind of decompose 5 into 2. 5 is equal to 2 plus 2 plus 1, for example. And this may seem dumb, but a very famous question in mathematics kind of asks, how many such decompositions are there? So I'm kind of decomposing 5 into a number of integers. So I think 5 has 9 partitions, if I remember off the top of my head. So 5, there's 4 plus 1, there's 3 plus 1 plus 1, there's 3 plus 2, there's 2 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1, and then there's 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1. And am I missing? Okay, maybe. So that's 6, but maybe I think the number
is not included, obviously.
Right, and so you can't add 0, otherwise you would get a lot of different possibilities. So we're working with positive integers only.
Okay.
And so it's been kind of a famous problem in mathematics. Kind of this problem comes up everywhere. I mean, you can see it's kind of a simple problem. Um, and I mean, it comes up in combinatorics everywhere. Kind of, if you have a number of candies, how many ways can you split them into separate boxes? For example, maybe. Um, and so it's been kind of a big problem in mathematics to, or at least maybe the dream was to try to get a very simple formula for this number. That's kind of the dream of everything in mathematics, to get simple formulas for things. But it turns out that this has kind of been impossible. No one's really been able to give a very simple formula for this number. We have tons of recursive formulas. We have tons of asymptotic formulas, but nothing that gives that's nice and easy to calculate that gives us the number immediately. And so my research was kind of surrounding this area, kind of more concerning kind of asymptotic formulas for these partition numbers. So, for example, it turns out that the partitions numbers are closely related to the Fourier coefficients of something called a modular form. So I talked about Fourier coefficients a little bit earlier. These, of course, come up everywhere in mathematics. And it turns out kind of the partition numbers kind of are famously connected to kind of a modular form. And so by kind of studying, so a modular form is kind of a complex function. So it's a function that takes in complex numbers and outputs complex numbers. And it turns out that kind of by studying the properties of this function, we can learn about the partition numbers. And so that's kind of the work I've been doing recently.
How'd you get into this?
Right, and so this was actually a summer program. I was led by an advisor at Texas A&M, who kind of presented us with this idea and presented us with this problem.
Nice.
And so I think that's a lot of how kind of at least early research happens. People give you something that's very closely related to something that's already been done. And so that's essentially how it was in our case.
Do you play an instrument?
I used to play the piano.
You used to play the piano. Okay.
It's actually quite surprising how many mathematicians play the piano.
I had a feeling. We're getting into that because Darius is also a musician, I believe.
I played the piano for 8-10 years, I think.
Okay, formally trained, right? Sheet music and learning pieces.
Sheet music, everything. I can't improvise.
That's the question I was going for. Can you improvise? And that's tied into our philosophical discussion here as well, because
I don't improvise at all.
Yeah.
And I think many of my mathematicians friends that play piano are similarly trained, kind of classically trained, read sheet music. I know a couple, of course, that write their own music, but I think on the majority, most of them are kind of just reading sheet music and playing it.
And Darius, you play an instrument? Or do you make electronic music, or?
No, I play guitar.
Nice.
And I sing.
Can you improvise?
Yes.
Interesting. What do you gentlemen feel? Do you feel as if there's a correlation, or perhaps it's merely coincidental, between the mathematician's approach to music and the philosopher's approach to music, the non-improvisation, improvisation, respectively?
I don't know if I can make that connection.
I don't feel comfortable making it either, but I think it's funny because I talked to someone the other day about how you have individuals who are formally trained and cannot improvise, and there's nothing wrong with that. And you have individuals who can only improvise and lack any kind of formal training. And I feel as if it's sometimes easier for the individual who's accustomed to improvising to learn about music theory, as opposed to someone who's formally trained in music theory to develop this spontaneous sense, you know. I'm a musician as well. I'm self-taught guitar and piano. and I'm interested in learning theory and writing music and stuff like that. But I feel as if it may have been more challenging for me if I was formally trained, because there's a certain amount of system. There's a system and there's rules and there's a methodology to the approach. And if I'm very strictly trained in that, like a mathematician, for instance, I kind of view it as analogously. I feel as if it would be hard to deviate from that, perhaps. I'm not sure, that's just a thought.
I learned organically, so
Mm-hmm.
I started playing when I was 10. And first of all, it's just a matter of dexterity, having your fingers be able to form different shapes on the fretboard. And then after that, you just kind of start playing. I started playing through the Mel Bay book, which is mostly what guitarists were taught by. And that's just one string at a time. But you also want to start creating your own music. So once you learn the chords and some different shapes, then you can start building your own songs, creating your own songs. But a lot of it comes from listening to other people, other musicians, albums. So I learned theory and kind of was coming up with my own music at the same time. But I feel like if you have like a classical musician and you're trying to have a session, like a jam session, then that classical musician is just not going to be able to play. He's going to break down. He's not going to be able to improvise because he's always playing sheet music and doesn't feel the music.
Right.
He's just reading the music.
I don't see anything wrong with either approach, but I can somehow see parallels between the approaches that you guys take to your academic investments, more or less.
Yeah. But if you have someone that's not that doesn't know anything about music theory, it's hard to play with.
Sure.
He's not going to know just a regular 12-bar blues. And it doesn't know the names of the chords or the notes on the fretboard.
But someone
that person would just be guessing.
Sure.
Playing by ear, which is I think the most important. But why not want to know about music theory? Because it's just kind of something that you're in the dark about.
Yeah.
So I think both are important, learning formally and learning by ear.
And that's why I feel as if it would be easier to jump from someone who's non-formally trained to someone who wants to learn more about the formalities of music, as opposed to someone who's just formally trained. I could see, like Eric says, it doesn't matter to me. I just want to play the fucking sheet music. I want to play these beautiful compositions as they were intended to be heard, and that's what I want to do. I don't want to make some bullshit jam band music over here. I don't know. Maybe it's a stretch to see these parallels, but
I'd like to know that I'd like to be able to play in a jazz band, but and also be able to have a jam session.
Yeah.
With somebody.
I like the parallels between. I feel like music can tie philosophy and mathematics together in a sense, because mathematics can be more rigorous and more strict. Philosophy can be as well, but I feel like philosophy lends to more improvisation at times, to speak analogously.
Yeah.
That what leads to more improvisation?
Philosophical inquiry.
Okay. This is what Nietzsche's talking about in The Birth of Tragedy. The Dionysian element versus the Apollonian.
Yes.
The Apollonian element is very formal, structured, and the Dionysian is uncouth, wild. And it's bringing those elements together that creates tragedy.
That's the point of this podcast, man. That's why it's so tragic. Trying to bring those two elements together.
Right.
I tend to lean more towards the uncouth, savage side, but I'm trying to learn more discipline here. But I like bringing together disciplines that are connected, but at the same time take different approaches, And it's important to me to see the similarities and the differences and to learn that way.
Yeah,
Yep.
I think a lot of mathematics is kind of what Darius mentioned earlier, that it's kind of hard to jam out with someone that doesn't know kind of the basic theory.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of mathematics is essentially like that. Kind of after you've kind of learned the standard undergraduate kind of curriculum, kind of the so-called kind of the basics of the theory, then you can kind of start to jam out and be creative in what you do.
Right.
But it's hard to do that with kind of without the absolute basics first. And
Like
so
talking to me, for instance, who's a fucking idiot when it comes to number theory. But, it's hard for you to jam out with me, more or less. But that's the whole point here, is for me to just feel stupid. I like challenging myself on those types of intellectual levels and trying to understand just a little bit. And it seems like there is a sense of community, Eric, that you experience within the university, within your field of study. And that's nice.
definitely.
It's not isolating. Which seems to kind of be the stereotype,
Yeah, I mean, mathematics, as I said, is extremely connected. There's the joint mathematics meeting, which is held every year in January, which is kind of the biggest math conference in the world. And it was in Denver this previous year when I went, and I believe the number was there were over 300,000 participants.
Holy shit.
And so there was essentially this large gathering of mathematics, kind of everyone doing their own thing. I mean, there are kind of hundreds of conference rooms of people talking about different things. And so those kind of events kind of show how kind of connected mathematics really is.
Well, that makes sense.
Where are you right now in university?
I'm about to be a fourth year, so.
Where?
I'm at Georgia Tech.
Oh, okay.
Via Seattle?
Yeah. So it's quite the flight.
What's your experience had been like in the American South, the Deep South? Had you had much experience there prior to college?
No, I had actually never been in the South until I went to college for the first time.
It's a little different in the city, I'm sure, but
Right, and especially even more so the campus. The campus is kind
its
of
own microcosm.
Completely different from the city, which is kind of completely different from the rest. I've explored a little bit. It is quite a bit different. I don't really know how I'd describe it.
I'm from Ohio, but the majority of the people that I work with are from the South, Tennessee, North Carolina, Alabama, and stuff. I like it. I mean, people down south seem a lot friendlier at times to me. People in Ohio, fucking assholes. They'll scream at you any chance that they get, and I probably fall into that category myself sometimes. But it's interesting to kind of branch out and experience those different aspects of American culture. I was just curious, like, what it was like to go down there.
Right, yeah.
It's a big school, right? I mean,
It is a big school, yeah, 20-some thousand people.
Yeah.
It honestly wasn't that it was nice kind of going into the school, because the school itself is not that much different from what I'm used to.
Mm-hmm.
But kind of getting out of it, things change a little bit.
No, that makes sense. Are you going straight to Ph.D., presumably?
Right, so I'm applying for graduate programs this fall.
Nice. Where do you want to go?
In number theory, of course. We'll see where I get in, I guess. I have a big list of schools I plan to apply to. Number theory is kind of one of the widest fields of mathematics, and so there are a lot of people and schools for me to choose from, which is a nice thing.
Top choice. MIT? Probably wouldn't go to MIT, maybe.
I think for PhDs in general, it's a lot more about the advisor.
Yeah.
Rather than...
someone you can jam with.
Right, and potentially someone that's famous to set you up for the future as well.
Get that juicy job upon graduation, baby.
Nice. I think it's hard. I'm still kind of developing kind of my preferences for number theory and exactly what I like to study. I've kind of been all over the place in my work. And so kind of part of graduate school for me is kind of dialing into exactly what I want to study. So it's hard to say.
And you like the academic world? It doesn't annoy you?
Yeah. I can see why a lot of people would be surprised. I mean, surprised that I want to do this academic stuff. For me, it has a lot of benefits. One, of course, is that I love teaching. So I've taught a lot. I've TA'd some courses, taught a lot of high schoolers. Teaching in general is kind of a lot of fun for me. And of course, I love doing research. And kind of being in academics kind of connects me to different researchers who I can kind of connect with and do research with. And so, yeah.
Oh, you do well. I mean, you excel at explaining your position and your interest in your research. It makes sense that you do teaching. And Darius, you do teaching as well, right? So
Yes.
you are both are kind of well versed in taking complicated ideas and breaking them down into more simplistic concepts, rather.
What are you doing right now, Miles?
Starting this podcast. I'm actually living in a garage. This is my only source of it. No, I'm just kidding. I'm doing a little bit of everything right now. I'm actually starting law school in January.
Oh.
So I figured I like to troll people on the internet. How could I apply this to a relevant career? Well, I can just be a troll professionally as a lawyer. So
Where are you going to law school?
the University of Akron. It's a small school nearby. So
That's a good school, though.
yeah, it's not bad. And
It's in the, I don't know, top 100.
yeah, it's not bad. I had to take the LSAT Flex, so
Oh yeah.
it was
Oh.
weird. Yeah, I had to
Do you,
take it
do you,
like
do you care to share your score?
156, but
Oh,
it wasn't anything outrageous. But I struggle with multiple choice questions. It's always been a major weakness for me. I went to school for biology as an undergrad, and that was nice. I could explain these concepts at length. Maybe it's because I'm just so full of shit. And if I used enough polysyllabic terms, the professor would just think I knew what I was talking about. I don't know. But I don't like multiple choice because I always second guess myself. Law
Right.
school is all about writing the answer. The bar exam, all about writing the answer is great. But the LSAT kicked my ass because it's like I overthink everything. Fortunately, I did well enough on the exam, and I credit that to the fact that I had not slept for almost 3 days beforehand, and my diet was completely fucked. I went on this fishing trip with my dad down on the Outer Banks, and I have a very strict discipline when it comes to like my diet and my sleep schedule and stuff like that. It's what helps me perform at my best mentally. And I completely fucked that all up right before this big ass test. And for, somehow I had to take it on my own time, in my own place, because I couldn't go anywhere because of COVID. So it was
Where in
weird, man.
where in Ohio are you from?
Up by Cleveland, just south of Cleveland.
I feel like Buffalo and Cleveland are brother sister cities,
Yeah, they both get dumped on with snow. That's for damn sure.
and our football teams.
Yeah, yeah, that
You
too.
know what I mean?
I love it, man. I love the misery that people experience when they root for their sports teams and they watch them fail year after year.
Yeah.
I'm not much for sports, but I am for watching human misery over something inconsequential. So.
Yeah, that's what it's been like.
Yes. And Eric, my only experience in the Pacific Northwest was when I went to Portland in 2017. I was excited. I would finally get to experience the
Right.
temperate Pacific Northwest, the dreariness, the overcast skies, and the 70s, 60s
Yeah.
rain.
Yeah.
So I got there, 100 degrees every day. Nonstop.
Yeah,
It's
I
the
don't
most
think
fucked
people
up
realize
thing, dude.
it gets pretty hot here in the summer. I think
it's bad.
it's 85 right now for me.
And the other thing was that in the East Coast, I think Darius may attest to this. People drive like assholes, you know. They scream at you, get the fuck out of my way, you know. They're riding your ass if you're going, you know, less than 20 miles over the speed limit. You know, I don't know if it's like that in Buffalo. Around here, it's like that. But when I went out west to Portland, everybody was just driving like 10 miles under the speed limit. Like, they're all too stoned to fucking do anything. I don't know. It was funny, man. It was an interesting change. So, but anyway, yeah, where are we at? I wanted to get you guys to fight a little bit or something. I thought we could. We're too connected, I guess. I don't know. No, I appreciate you guys talking to me.
Yeah, no, that's fun.
Yeah, no problem.
I meant to get after it earlier, and if you guys would be interested in continuing this later down the line, I like to view my podcast as like a continuation. You know, like it never really ends. I'm just constantly developing it, and putting it out there, and
Yeah.
over time. But what I really want to do is, first of all, when we're done, hook me up with you guys' email address or the best way to contact you, so I can stay in touch. And right now, before we go, I wanted you guys to like kind of do some shameless self-promotion. If you'd like to start, Darius, I don't know. You said you have music and stuff.
I have an album.
Nice.
And I recorded a couple years ago. It's just my acoustic guitar and myself. And Darius Mallon, just search it on YouTube.
All right, we'll do.
Nice. And link me to it. I'll look it up. If I can't find it, though, I will ask you. And Eric, you got to hook me up with that name of that paper, man. Do you have it?
I will. Let's see.
I want to plagiarize you when I'm in law school and see if anybody notices. Just working these really abstract number theory equations and something that I write and give to the professor.
This one's a little easier to comprehend, maybe. Maybe not.
We'll see. Maybe I'll do a reading. Maybe I can read it and we'll do like an audio book or something. You know, you can sell it.
It's a little, maybe too many numbers.
Perfect.
Yeah, not much what I want to promote. I do have somewhat of a blog where I post some mathematical related content.
Sweet.
It's on my website. The link is just ericzoo0.wordpress.com.
Okay.
So if you're interested in, I don't have that many posts. I hope to write more. And so maybe I'll write some of this partition stuff up too. But yeah, if you want to read about some number theory, some mathematics, I have a blog there.
Cool, I'll check it out. And before I leave, Darius, what should I read? Reading recommendation?
Reading recommendations? I've been getting into economics lately.
Really? I would recommend to you Thomas Sowell. I don't know if you've ever heard of him before.
Thomas Sowell?
Yeah. Sowell.
Okay.
You would get into that. Maybe.
Yeah.
I'm going to definitely read some Heidegger here. Because I feel like I haven't read enough.
If you do read Heidegger, read the basic... let me look it up real quickly. Because you don't want to read Being in Time.
No.
Heidegger,
I really want to read it because you said that.
Yeah. Basic Writings by Heidegger.
Okay.
That's the one you would recommend?
Yeah, because those are his essays that he wrote after Being in Time, and they're
What's Being in
easier
Time?
to follow. Being in Time is his magnum opus.
That's the big one, huh? That's the great work.
Yeah, but it won't make any sense.
Perfect. It'll be like reading James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake. It's all nonsensical. Or the Principia Mathematica by Bertrand Russell. It's all symbolic logic for 9,000 pages. Do you do any writings, Darius, that I should be aware of? Or do you write anything? Do you plan to write a book? I mean,
I have
journals?
my thesis. I don't know how it's accessible though. You'd have to email me.
Nice. I'll plagiarize that too. That was another recommendation I would always make the people in school is if a professor gives you a writing assignment, which probably won't happen for you guys, but maybe someone listening. If a professor gives you a writing assignment, plagiarize your professor and see if they notice. Take some of their research, throw it in there, say it's your own, and see what they say. It's good for them, keeps them on their toes. So, okay, gentlemen. Well,
Yeah.
thanks.
Maybe a book recommendation from me too.
Yes.
There's a book called the Whale Conjectures by Karen. I think it's Karen Olson. Yeah, Karen Olson. It's a great book about these two famous siblings, so Andre Whale and Simone Whale. I think Darius might know Simone Whale, actually. She was a philosopher. I forget. I mean, I don't know anything about. I don't know much about philosophy, but I believe she was quite a famous philosopher.
Okay. I don't know her.
Yeah. But anyways, the book is kind of partially a historical account of these two famous siblings. Andre Whale was one of, someone might say, the most influential number theorist of the 20th century, who created these things, kind of these mathematical conjectures called the Whale conjectures. And so the book is kind of a historic account of their story, but it's also partially a historical account of actually the author's story of mathematics and how she got into mathematics and how mathematics kind of seemed to her. And so it's a great read. I have a copy of the book upstairs. Maybe you should grab it and show it to you. But
Yeah, just hold it up page by page. I'll take a picture, and then maybe turn the page, and then I want to buy it.
It's actually quite a cheap book. I think I got a copy for like $2.
No, that'll be good. I like reading those books that are mathematically based but intended for the general public. They can still be very challenging. Like I read The Emperor's New Mind by Roger Penrose, Gödel Escher Bach by I forget what his name was, and Chaos by James Gleek. And there's a lot of those texts out there that are really good.
But
it's easy to kind of get caught up in it. And I think that's why I like philosophy so much, is that I don't know, that mathematics and philosophy seem to be very much interconnected, in as much as both of them are often driven by individuals who are looking for truth. They're looking to develop a more robust understanding of why things are the way that they are. They just use different mechanisms for developing that understanding. Some people use symbolic representation. Others use cross-referential representation. Are you, Eric, familiar with Gödel's incompleteness theorem at all?
Right, yeah.
So, I don't know much about that, but any of those guys that kind of just come along and really shatter our preconceived ideas of how we think things operate. That's what I like. That's why I started this podcast. I wanted to just kind of be like, what the fuck, I didn't think about it that way before.
Have either of you looked at Leibniz's calculus?
Yes, so Newton and Leibniz developed it independently, right?
Right.
At the same time.
Yeah. I was just wondering if either of you had ever read any of
I've
Leibniz.
not read it, but
much.
I mean, what is calculus? When I took calculus, it was finding the slope of a line at a very, very narrow, very, very magnifying.
Rates of change.
Yeah, rate of change, right?
Yeah. Well, that's the beauty of calculus, is that.
What are people? What do you use calculus for, though? What is it used for?
Physics.
Physics?
Motion.
Yeah. I mean, the bad example is like when you take the derivative of kind of a velocity function, you get acceleration. For example. That's like partially how it's used.
So, okay. That's how you get acceleration? That's how you
Yeah,
measure acceleration?
Yeah,
kind
so
of. I
velocity
mean,
is speed and direction, right? I believe.
right. Or you can think of acceleration as kind of the change in velocity, right? How much
Okay.
your velocity is changing. And so, kind of given a velocity, you take the derivative of your velocity to get what your acceleration is.
Okay.
Of course,
Have
there
you
are a lot.
looked at original calculus and how they came up with that? How they formulated it? I'm just wondering if you've looked at it. How it
Not
was.
really. I mean, I've definitely heard of some stuff. I think part of why things were hard is that people didn't have a good idea of what limits were. So to kind of define what a derivative is, you kind of need this notion of a limit. And people weren't great at dealing with that. Kind of limits are kind of this idea of kind of infinitesimally small things in some sense, and people didn't know how to rigorously formalize that. I don't believe I don't believe Newton did this either. Newton didn't really formalize exactly what this limit was.
Okay, explain limits one more time.
So limits are kind of what happens when you get extremely close to something.
Okay.
So you have a function, and so for example, maybe you can look at what happens as the function goes to infinity, or as x goes to infinity, kind of what happens to the function. And so that's kind of what it means to take a limit.
Okay.
And so to define a derivative, like you said, it's kind of taking the slope of some 2 points that are really close together. But kind of the definition of a limit is what happens when the points get closer and closer and closer.
Okay.
And so that's kind of why you need a rigorous definition of a limit to define a derivative. And so that's a lot of what they struggled with, kind of these infinitesimals.
And Newton was doing such novel experiments, or he was thinking about things in such a different way that he needed a new mathematical language to describe it, more or less. Like
Right.
the old method wasn't working for him, so he had to kind of come up with it. But the question goes back to, did he discover it, or did he create it?
Right.
What was the hardest class you took, Eric?
Oh,
What was the class that was just like, fuck that? I'm sure you probably got an A still, but there had to have been one that was just like, nope, no thanks, not for me.
yeah. So this past semester, I took in class in what's called algebraic geometry.
Mm-hmm.
So there's the study of kind of linear algebra, which kind of studies linear equations, kind of the ax plus b type equations. But you can generalize that. So you kind of generalize to look at polynomials in general. And algebraic geometry kind of concerns what do kind of the solution sets of polynomials look like. So for example, you graph y equals x squared and you get kind of a parabola. But you kind of want to generalize. What do higher polynomials kind of look like in some sense? What are kind of what geometric properties do graphs to equations have in some sense? Is kind of the essence of what algebraic geometry is.
And that one was a little out there for you, huh?
It's quite a difficult class. Yeah, there's a lot of
Did
on
anybody
one
cry?
hand, you need to use a lot of geometric intuition for kind of the way things work. But on the other hand, there's a lot of kind of abstractness and rigorous definitions, and so it was quite a difficult class.
Can you explain imaginary numbers?
Yeah.
Right?
Right. So I think that at least the historical motivation for imaginary numbers was kind of wanting to solve polynomials. Kind of as you know, like in quadratics, there are some quadratics you can't solve. So, of course, x squared plus 1 equals 0. Kind of people working with the real numbers back then couldn't solve this. There are no real number solutions to this equation. And so people thought, okay, what if we would like this to have a solution, right? It currently doesn't have a solution. What if we define I to be a number to this solution? And they kind of went from there. So I now has the property that I squared is equal to -1. What kind of arithmetic can we do with it? What happens if we kind of add it to a real number? What happens then? But I think the motivation was coming out of trying to have solutions to polynomials. And there are kind of big branches of math that kind of generalize these ideas.
Closing thoughts, gentlemen.
Who else have you had on your podcast?
So far, I've had an individual, Robert Dugan III, who is an English teacher in Morgan County, West Virginia. And him and I spoke about the impact of the opioid crisis there, the socioeconomic consequences of opioid use in West Virginia, and how West Virginia, which is a state that's always fascinated me. I don't know if either of you have ever been there before. It's very beautiful landscape there, Appalachia. Very wild and wonderful, as the name suggests. But also, the people there are subject to pretty great turmoil in a lot of ways. There's a lot of inopportunity, like as far as employment goes. Like you go into a coal mine, or you go work at Dollar General, or you do heroin. That's about it. So that was interesting. And I talked to another Nietzschean philosopher who him and I just more or less go back and forth bullshit about our interpretations of reality. So I'm trying to get it out there. If you guys ever have any recommendations for people that I should interview or talk to, I really just like to hear about what people are working on. You know what I mean? What they're doing with themselves. One of the primary motivations for the podcast was to hopefully inspire people to some extent to do something other than just watch TV and rot away. You know, like get the fuck out there and do something, learn something new, and create and challenge yourself. You know, so it's kind of where I'm at. But
Thanks for having me on. This was a lot of fun.
This was super interesting. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thanks guys. I appreciate it. I'll link everybody to you guys in the description of the podcast, and stick with me as we develop. Feel free to tell everybody about the podcast.
Yeah. Okay.
And hopefully we can talk again if you guys would be interested. I'd be definitely down for a continuation of this. So stay in touch, and thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
All right. See you guys.
Yeah, have a good night.